Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Um, I usually have a practice of not trying to have a class before 10 o'clock, so this is an unnatural act for me, to be here at this at this hour. This is like really early for an academic. Now you want to come at 9 o'clock at night? Okay, we're fine. We'll do those. Also, thanks to everyone online. Um, and so, first of all, welcome to this discussion about, should the Wolf Amendment be repealed? And, it's really only in space communities where you can start that way saying, well, the Wolf Amendment, everybody nods and goes, yes, they know what that is. And they're all familiar with it. You don't have to spend a lot of time explaining what. But I think it does deserve a little bit of explanation. Our lineup today will hopefully do that. My good friend and colleague, Robert Sutter, who's one of our China specialists here, will be giving remarks about 9:15. He's busy writing a book, but I did lean on him to kind of come and talk about larger framework for China and talk about that. Because I think sometimes in the space community, we do get very focused on our own issues and we forget the larger framework that's going on. And Robert is absolutely a China person. He's not a space person, proudly, and will hopefully give us some context for thinking about this issue about the Wolf Amendment. Second thing I'd like to do is to give, of course, a little bit of history on this, because for some people it seems like the Wolf Amendment's been around forever. So, obviously maybe go time and look at it. But there was a time when it didn't exist. And one of the periods where it didn't exist was up through in Bush 43 administration. My boss at the time was Mike Griffin at NASA, and he was going off to China to go on a tour and talk with our Chinese counterparts. NASA had started some bilateral discussions. Remember with Sean O'Keefe, we had the China National Space Agency come over, and we went over and had talked with them. And the kinds of topics were very familiar to those of us who had been exposed to the sort of US-Soviet period. Some small, relatively uncontroversial things in earth science, things of exchange of scientific data of various kinds. And so things that sort of the system could kind of bear, nothing too exotic, nothing like, Soyuz, shuttle docking or something like that. Those large breakthroughs were not on the table. But okay, what could we do? And we had a number of working groups. So in the course of preparing to go over there, we of course met with important members of Congress, including appropriators like Congressman Frank Wolf. And, it would be no secret to say that Mr. Wolf was not thrilled at us going over there. And basically because he had concerns about human rights issues, particularly persecution of Christians in China. And this was top of the list. But he wanted to know what were we doing, what did we plan to do, and so forth. And Mike kind of laid out for him. And in, those of you who know Mike, he's a quintessential engineer, no diplomacy here, about what he was looking to do. And Mr. Wolf, again, not happy, but again, understood and said, okay, if you guys need to do anything, you come back and you'll talk to us. Yes, sir, happy to do that. Not going to do anything stupid. And this is what we think the traffic will bear. So goes and has the trip, relatively uneventful, except for when the Chinese wanted to take him to see a launch site and one of their launch assembly facilities. And Mike goes, well, can I go inside? And they go, well, no, we really can't do that. He goes, I'm not going to bother going down there. I've already seen it from the outside. I don't need to go on the inside. Thank you very much. Again, no diplomacy here. Later, in the next administration, Obama administration, Dr. John Holdren was a science advisor. And he was up and testifying before Mr. Wolf's committee and said, well, and he was asked about what thoughts about space cooperation with China. And Dr. Holdren gave a very undiplomatic answer, even less diplomatic, I think, than Mike Griffin would have given, which basically said, this is a prerogative of the executive branch. Thank you very much. Mr. Wolf was not amused by that answer and basically cut OSTP's budget by about 50% and said, hi, do I have your attention now? Then asked again about, okay, what are you planning to do? And again, got told, well, this is an executive branch thing. Thank you very much for your interest in America's space program. That didn't sit well with him. And so the Wolf Amendment came out of a conflict, not merely over, US views of Chinese human rights abuses, but also a disagreement between the Congress and the White House. I mean, fundamentally, Mr. Wolf did not trust the White House to do the right thing. He was more skeptical that he didn't think they even had a plan. They're just going to kind of make it up and wing it. But even if they had a plan, he probably would have been unhappy with it. So the Wolf Amendment, in fact, has persisted, I would argue, because of that continuing mistrust between the different branches of Congress and the White House. And more important, and also just as importantly, it's debatable, and we'll have that discussion about whether the juice is worth the squeeze. Because I'm a recovering physicist, I make analogies to physics occasionally, even if they're bad. And one of them is sort of the idea of an energy barrier. You think of here you are at one state, and you want to be over here at another state, and this future state is kind of a lower energy system, less friction, desirable, all that kind of thing. But to go from here to there, you've got to go over an energy hump. You got to get enough energy to get up over the top and get down to the other side. Well, you can think of that energy barrier as, political friction. So there may be some desirable place you want to get to, but you've got to get over this hump to get to the other side. In the case of the Soviet Union, that political friction decreased, and it didn't go away, but it decreased dramatically with the fall of the Soviet Union. And on top of that, the Russians, had things that we wanted. They had heavy lift vehicles, they had a lot of experience in a long duration human spaceflight, very, very experienced cadre. And so there was a place we wanted, and the energy barrier that had been between us had decreased enough such that it was worthwhile to engage in things like shuttle mirror cooperation and eventually, of course, the International Space Station. In the case of the Chinese, you can make an argument that they have stuff we want. There's definitely capabilities there, but the energy barrier is not only high, if not higher, than it was in the immediate post-Soviet period. Now, this doesn't mean that among space people there aren't things that are attractive. I remember when Administrator Charlie Bolden went to China, and he sat down, those big overstuffed chairs, they have the Chinese leadership looks at, and there's some big painting of waves crashing on rocks in the background, symbolizing the tumult nature of the international relations and all that. Whatever the scenery is, it's usually never something calm and peaceful. It's usually something dramatic. And he starts off by saying to Charlie, he says, "We don't need you." Charlie's like, "Well, this is going well." And then he next goes, "And you don't need us." And Charlie's like, "Well, yeah, that's kind of true. But we could do great things together." And Charlie's like, "Well, yeah, that's true. We could. Okay, but it's not up to just us. Okay, it is really up to a larger context in the field." Now, another mythology that space people are also very prone to is they think space is really important. It is, but that it can shape international relations barely. Space, as my students are tired of hearing, is fundamentally a lagging indicator of international relations, not a leading indicator of international relations. So during the 1980s, we had arguments about, well, we should cooperate with the Soviets in going to Mars because we would then learn to work together in space, and that will spill over into peace and understanding, here on Earth, as if. And I was opposed to that. And even though I was quite a space advocate, National Space Society, people remember the old L5 Society, that lot. And I was against it. And my bumper sticker slogan at conferences was "No gulags on Mars." That is, we were not interested in taking tensions and problems and conflicts and areas where we have a fundamental clash of values and exporting that to other planets, because it's not merely our machines and our astronauts who go in space, but it also represents our values. And so not interested in having a gulag on Mars. Now, China is welcome to operate in space, the province of all mankind and all that. They have a perfect right to be there. But that doesn't mean that we have to necessarily accept all the values and so forth that they represent. And it also means that the level of cooperation we're going to have, in which we can debate, depends on what the overall relationship sort of looks like. So if we were to change the Wolf Amendment, I mean, again, a good policy question, how robust are your conclusions? What assumption, if changed, would cause you to think something different? I would say the change in the U.S.-China relationship would have to change. What would that mean? Well, actually, if you really ask me my opinion, I'll put the same answer I gave in the late 80s when we were talking about the Soviet Union, when there were still Sovietologists in grad school. That's how old I am. It was like, well, I don't know, I'll settle for free elections, free labor unions, free immigration, a free press, exchangeable currencies. And I was, of course, accused by one of my other grad students who was of a more practical bent to say, well, God, you just want them to surrender. And I go, yeah, that's about right. And that, in fact, did happen. Now, I don't expect the Chinese Communist Party to surrender anytime soon. I think they are much more robust and much more dug in than the Soviets were. We can have that discussion. Maybe Dr. Sutter can talk about that. But I'd like to see a change in the relationship before I'd be talking about changing the Wolf Amendment, which has a practical effect and has a symbolic effect. And I think people can argue that the symbolic effect is more negative than the benefits are, and that we should look at potential benefits of changing it. I would say, what do I get for it? And I'd like to have a situation where the commander of the Indo-PACOM can get his phone calls returned. I'd like to see a situation where maybe Chinese ships are not harassing those of our ASEAN friends in the South China Sea. I don't know whether I could satisfy Mr. Wolf's criteria on stopping the persecution of Christians and other minorities in China. But if we even look at external Chinese action, cyberspace, IP, and so forth, but part of the reason we're concerned about China and space is not because we have an immediate conflict in space. In fact, I think space is one of the areas where we might have some areas, at least, of what they used to call peaceful coexistence or détente and whatever, comrade. But because there are things I think we could do together in space, but they're not inseparable from the rest of the relationship. And so, if we could find ways to say get the idea across that the rest of the relationship could be improved, then we could think about changes to the practical and symbolic aspects of the Wolf Amendment. Let me pause there, and we can take outrage questions later. But I'd like to see if we can get Dr. Sutter on.
Floor is yours, sir.
Hello. Should I start?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be with you today. I'm going to do two things to follow up on Scott's very useful introduction. One is to provide some context and on U.S.-China relations and the hardening of U.S. relations with China. And the other is to then give you a sense of what's happening under the Trump in 2025 under the new Trump administration. I'm just going to adjust the lighting here 1 second. Yeah. Oh, that's not as worky there. Okay, well, 1 second. Okay, let's look at the context. We've had 8 years of a hardening of U.S. policy toward China. This hardening started with the Trump administration, first one, in their national security strategy of December 2017. That document was like a Cold War document, and it said China was the #1 threat to the United States. China has never been the #1 threat to the United States until that time. This document didn't get much attention. But what you found is that bipartisan majorities of Congress agreed. They worked over the next year, and by August, they passed legislation calling for a whole of government effort against Chinese efforts that they saw as very negative for the United States. And so bipartisan majorities of Congress have been very instrumental in continuing this process of hardening toward China, and is bipartisan. And it's focused on various challenges. They're trying to defend America against all these challenges of Chinese behavior. And so this is very important to understand, and because there's so many of these challenges. So to deal with it, I count maybe 100 or 85 challenges over the years. So to deal with it, there are basically three clusters of challenges. The first cluster is the cluster of strategic challenges in the Indo-Pacific, and particularly the balance of power in Asia. The U.S. has worked since World War II to prevent East Asia from being dominated by a hostile power, just like it does in Western Europe. And this has been the case. And what is seen now is that China has now emerged to be such a power that it could be the dominant power in the Asia Pacific region. And that would be seen as a fundamental threat to the United States, as Imperial Japan was prior to Pearl Harbor, and Nazi Germany was as it advanced into Western Europe. And so this is a very serious matter. The second cluster are economic challenges, and there are a whole range of these. But the Chinese, through various negative features of their development policies, has been very successful. And the upshot is they're now in a position to challenge the United States for the high technology industries of the future. This is an area where the United States still has a lead. But if these technologies and industries are controlled by China or led by China, this is something that would be very dangerous for the United States. We would lose that economic capacity, that stature, and the wealth that comes with it. But more importantly, the militaries of the world depend on high technology. And this would mean that China would have the best military in the world. So these two, the security balance in Asia and the high-tech competition, are clearly very existential dangers for the United States. And there's a whole slew of other dangers on governance, where the Chinese governance practices are so antithetical to the United States in so many ways, supporting a different order of the world, and using their leverage all the time to gain influence. And so this is something that if you're engaging in exchanges with China, you better think about what they're trying to do as far as their leverage is concerned. Okay, so those are the three things, with these two as existential dangers for the United States. And on that basis, we had a progression of executive branch actions that worked with Congress. Donald Trump worked closely with Congress, particularly after COVID hit the United States in March of 2020. And so that last year of the Trump administration was very harsh on China, and Congress was right along with them, passing over 300 bills that year, just being tough on China. Biden came in and he was soft on China from Trump's point of view, and he had to harden his policy. And he came in, he read the intel, and he changed. And his whole team changed. And they became very firm on China, very effective in dealing with China's challenges in a whole range of ways. And so this hardening has continued. It's a bipartisan story in Congress. It has wide support. And why does it get so much support? Why is the sense of urgency? They fear, bottom line, they fear dominance, that China's going to dominate. If China succeeds in these two critical areas, they're going to dominate in the minds of many. And so that fear is the thing that I think it fundamentally drives what we're seeing, what we have been seeing in Congress. So that's the context that I'd like to just lay out for you to think about as far as what's at stake here. In 2025, Congress is continuing this stuff. But of course, it's overshadowed by the president, and the president exerts extraordinary control of the government. I have never seen such a powerful president in my whole life. He has control over the executive branch in a way I've just not ever seen. He controls the Congress through the Republican Party, and boy, does he control the Republican Party. And this is a very powerful, and he's so influential in the courts. The Supreme Court has 9 justices, 3 were appointed by Trump, and 3 others by Republicans. And so He has a lot of clout, and he doesn't have any advisors now that are willing to stand up to him. It just so that's very different from the first Trump administration. So basically, you're dealing with a very powerful president, and he can change the policy. If he wants to do it, he can do it. And look what he did with Putin. He switched, I mean, he switched several times, but the first time he switched dramatically. And what did the Republicans in Congress, so many of them committed to to countering Putin, they just shut up. They said nothing. So this is power. And so could something like this happen with China? Well, we've had ups and downs with China over the last this year. And the upshot here, it's been focused on economics. It's focused on the tariffs and trade and export restrictions. Uh, Keep in mind that Donald Trump, unlike just about any major leader I can see of in the United States, does not say China is a threat. If you can help me on this, I'm still looking, and I've examined this going back over a decade. I don't think he's ever called China a threat. They take advantage of us. That's the argument he takes. He doesn't say they're a threat, like many people in his first administration and many people in the second administration. So he doesn't think that way. And so that's very important to me anyway, in making my calculus. What does he want? He doesn't have that sense of urgency. He doesn't have that fear, doesn't seem to. So it's very different. So could it go in a different way? Well, it is going in a different way. And that's what's important to understand at this point. Basically, he's tough on tariffs, but then he backs away and they compromise. They're dealing, and he's looking for a deal. He's looking for an economic deal with China that will be beneficial to the United States, beneficial to him. And is he worried about the threat? I don't think so. I don't see it. And so the point here is that we're now in a position where they've stabilized the economic relationship. They've reached a compromise. They're going to be working on this for over a year. And in that working period, this is what the Chinese calculus seems to be here. You just string them out. You string him out, you give a few agreements as you go along, and he doesn't get his final deal. And so when he's in that mode, records show he's best behavior for China. So he's not doing things for Taiwan that the U.S. ordinarily will do. He's curbing arms sales. He's not allowing visits. He's doing a whole bunch of things that are making sure that Taiwan doesn't get in the way of this kind of accommodation of Beijing. So you're dealing with this now, and it's very uncertain, and all sorts of elements can come in and complicate it. We've had these ups and downs on the trade issue just in the last 9 months that have been quite dramatic, or they look dramatic. But the fundamental thing here is that it's not looking at China as a threat. And so often, and on the Chinese side, they want exchanges. Now you look at it as they're for their leverage, which they're always looking for leverage. This will give them leverage in a lot of ways. They want to make sure that the relationship with China, U.S. relations stays cordial to some degree. And they get information, they get analysis. They're constantly looking for these kinds of things for their own advantage. But they do seem to want this. And I think they would want NASA exchanges. And so the question is, would the Congress want this? And I frankly say, if you ask them right now without Trump intervening, they say, no, of course not. We don't trust those sons of bees at all. They'll do whatever they need to do to take advantage of us. And that's, I think, very common in Congress. But Trump can override that. And so he may just say, oh, yeah, we're going to be more exchanges. Yeah. I mean, we had this with the students. You maybe recall that, first the administration was going to cut back on Chinese students and more higher difficulties with the visa applications and so forth. And then Trump goes and says, no, we want 600,000 Chinese students. We have about 280,000 now. This kind of thing. So I'm sorry to be indecisive in looking at the present, but I think my point is the Congress, bipartisan majorities of Congress are still countering Chinese challenges. They're busy doing that, but they're careful not to cross the president. And the president is interested in keeping a stable relationship with China as he seeks the bigger deal on the economic side with China. And he's curbing his relationships with Taiwan for sure. And I think you could argue he's curbing his relationships elsewhere that could complicate his efforts to deal with China. And in that process, the idea of a dynamic between NASA and China is not, if it was last year, I would say it's impossible. It's not going to happen. This year, I would say it depends on Trump. And if he thinks it's a good idea, I think it'd be very hard to stop. So that's my sense of both the context. I hope that helps you understand the sense of what's going on in Washington. Many of you know this better than I do in many cases. But the other side of it is the current situation, which is uncertain, but it's certainly more moderate than it was, and it's led by a very powerful president who has never seen China as a threat. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Whedon. I'm the Director of Civil and Commercial Space Policy at the Aerospace Center for Space Policy and Strategy. Welcome to today's event, which, as Scott mentioned, is a partnership between Aerospace Corporation and George Washington University Space Policy Institute. Thank you, Scott, for the history lesson. Love the stories, always good stuff. And as you saw from that, this is not a new topic in the space world. What do we do about China? And as you saw from Professor Sutter's introduction, there is this broader question of the US-China relationship, how that has evolved, how that's changing, and what that's like in the future. We asked Professor Sutter to give that, to provide that broader context for what we're going to talk about now, which is back to a very focused discussion on what do we do about that US-China relationship on civil space activities. We tend to think of those as things done by NASA, human space flight, but I would say broader civil space in general. Also, as Scott mentioned in his intro, a lot of people in the space community know of the Wolf Amendment, have heard of it, but I would use they describe it as almost a magical incantation. You describe, something NASA and China in the same sentence, and you hear, oh, but the Wolf Amendment, ... And I tend to disagree with Scott a little bit in that I'm not sure that many people actually know what the Wolf Amendment says versus what they think it says. So I'll just go through and actually talk about the language for a second. So this is the original language that was put into the 2011 Appropriations Bill for the Subcommittee on Commerce, Justice, Science, and Related Agencies, which funds NASA and other agencies. So the language prohibits NASA and the White House Office of Science, Technology, Policy, OSTP, from spending money on any bilateral policy, program, order, or contract of any kind, or to participate, collaborate, or coordinate bilaterally in any way with China, including government agencies, as well as any Chinese-owned company. In addition, government funds could not be used to host Chinese visitors or facilitate visits of Chinese nationals to any NASA facilities. Now, there's an important but to that, without prior permission from Congress. Right? So it's not that NASA can't do it at all, it's they have to ask permission from Congress. And as Scott mentioned, the effect of that over time has been NASA has largely chosen to not do anything with China, in part because of that political or obstacle hurdle to getting that permission. In the 15 years or so since the Wolf Amendment was first put in place, there have definitely been changes in the world. The most significant is that China has now come into its own as a space power. China today has a very sophisticated set of space capabilities across civil, national security, and a growing commercial space industry. And that, I think, leads us to a question of reevaluating what we're going to talk about today. Is this sort of restriction, or I would say barrier, still applicable to what we're doing? Last thing I want to mention before I turn over to our speakers here is we're not just talking about direct US-China human spaceflight cooperation. What I want to talk about today is what our policy and approach should be to US-China engagement in space in general, which could include direct cooperation, but lesser things such as discussing policies and norms, exchanging data as well. And I think that's important. A couple weeks ago, former NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine, who led NASA during the first Trump administration and created the Artemis program, was speaking at an event here in town hosted by CSIS, and he said that they had tried or wanted to bring China into the Artemis Accords, but couldn't, and left the implication that part of the challenge there was the Wolf Amendment and the restrictions on that bilateral cooperation. So today, we're going to have a live debate with our two experts here on this specific question of whether or not the Wolf Amendment should be repealed. And as I said, in the context of broader US-China space engagement. On my left is Dan Hart, currently a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the president of Hart Technologies, where he advises space, defense, and technology companies and investment groups. Dan has served in multiple senior leadership roles across a wide range of aerospace programs, spanning human spaceflight, satellite development, space launch, and missile defense. Dan is going to be arguing the positive case, that is, yes, it is time to repeal the Wolf Amendment. On my right is Dean Chang, currently a non-resident senior fellow at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, also a non-resident fellow with George Washington University Space Policy Institute. Dean is a well-respected scholar and author on Chinese foreign and defense policy, including their space program. Dean will be arguing the negative case that no, it is not time to repeal the Wolf Amendment. I'm going to give each of them about 10 minutes or so to make their initial case. This is sort of back to high school debate, if anybody's done that, right? So we're going to have each make their initial case. I'm then going to give each of them a few minutes for a rebuttal to the other. I have a couple of challenging questions for each of them. And then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience here in the room. So, Dan, over to you for your opening argument.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks to the Space Policy Institute, Scott, and to Aerospace Corporation, Brian, for having us here for this. I do want to say, for starters, Scott, please forgive me, but I'm going to take issue with your comment about space being a lagging indicator. Space diplomacy was actually started with the beginning of NASA by Eisenhower. So I'll give an example, but we can talk about that as an additional debate and afterwards. So starting off, the Wolf Amendment does not serve the interests of the United States and should be repealed. And I'm going to start at the top. I think Dr. Sutter really laid out the stage here. But we're the US and China, the two largest economies. We do over $600 billion in trade each year. Tens of thousands of US companies and tens of millions of Americans do business with China. So we're not in isolation. We are in space, but we're not in isolation here on Earth. We have mutual reliance, of course, on technology, minerals, agriculture, manufacturing, markets, and more. And we have an enormous amount of problems, as Dr. Sutter pointed out. We have a soaring trade imbalance, disputes over Taiwan, South China Sea. We're competing for influence in the developing world. IP threats and theft has been a huge issue. Cyber, and we're seeing a huge military buildup in China. So it's not exactly it's a bit of an unnerving situation here in the US. However, the recent meeting between President Trump and President Xi Jinping did highlight a lot of the things that Dr. Sutter brought out. There are efforts being made to come up with a way to coexist, to find stability, and to tip away from the acrimony and, frankly, potential military conflict that has been brewing. And in the current situation, the identification of areas of agreement and joint initiatives would likely prove useful as lubricants. So now let's talk about space. Our government space programs have always been designed around two very different motivations, and it's very important to keep a separation of thought across those. On the one hand, we have military utility for reconnaissance, communication, navigation, and space defense itself, and that's the mission of the Space Force. We're not going to talk a huge amount about that today, but that's critical. NASA's mission, on the other hand, is rooted in science and exploration. And this taps into a universal, instinctive drive in all humans to understand our world, our universe, and where we fit in it. And that's a drive that unites us all. Clearly, cooperation in space exploration is not some panacea that's going to solve all of our terrestrial problems. However, it's remained for generations prominent in our collective imagination. Kennedy used this global fascination during the most intense and dangerous times of the Cold War, when he presented proposals for space exploration cooperation directly to Chairman Khrushchev. He must have seen it as a welcome diversion for cooling the temperature. Kennedy and Khrushchev, who in March of 1962 were leading countries locked in bitter disputes, exchanged warm letters at the time outlining proposals for cooperation, even while the US and the Soviets were exploding nuclear bombs in space. I mean, we haven't quite approached that. Hopefully we won't. In his response, Khrushchev wrote the following: "We sincerely desire that the establishment of cooperation in the field of peaceful use of outer space facilitate the improvement of relations between our countries, the easing of international tensions, and the creation of a favorable situation for the peaceful settlement of urgent problems here on our own Earth." So there was clearly a vision that was being presented by the leaders, and honestly, back to lagging or whether it's a lagging indicator, that's dependent upon what the leader does. And here, Kennedy and Khrushchev were using space as a leading indicator to break the ice. Perhaps that minor exchange of humanity helped in some small way to avoid the unthinkable tragedy in the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, which was only 6 months later. Additionally, Kennedy's willingness to collaborate even with an adversary was demonstrated in his final UN speech about 8 weeks before his death. In the speech, he extended an invitation to the Soviets to join with the US in our quest to land astronauts on the moon, to do the lunar mission jointly. By making this offer, he created a strong narrative, generated soft power, and positioned the US as the first among nations leading humankind into the final frontier. This theme was carried forward and built upon by LBJ, Nixon, and eventually Reagan. We find ourselves in another monumental conflict. It would be wise for our leaders to look back and take a play from Kennedy's playbook. Now let's talk more specifically about the Wolf Amendment. The Wolf Amendment, as was just discussed, was hastily constructed and born out of personal and political differences, and it does not serve our interests. It diminishes our ability to leverage NASA and its core space exploration diplomatic mission at a time when we're navigating a fraught relationship with China. It potentially deteriorates the US prestige and admiration we've earned as the global leader of space exploration. And it is a wasteful, self-imposed bureaucracy. It's poor governance and is redundant to other more effective and broader measures that are in place. It can be argued that the current form of the Wolf Amendment does not forbid all aspects of collaboration in civil space with China, but its clear effect has been to do just that. There has been nearly no cooperation between NASA and the Chinese National Space Agency for over a decade, all while the value and criticality of cooperating is growing. The need to establish norms of behavior in space is critical to avoid misunderstandings, miscalculations, and collisions, and also to assure adherence to the Outer Space Treaty. Our economies are now reliant on space, and our space exploration missions are growing more complex, and the benefits of collaborating are increasing. By requiring certification to Congress, 4 committees, by the way, plus the FBI, of any task or contract proposed for collaboration with Chinese entity, the Wolf Amendment effectively eliminates nearly any cooperation. NASA may not, well, you said it, you know, all those words, can't do anything with China. NASA leaders have no incentive to divert attention and support from their primary programs to introduce even minute aspects of cooperation to Congress, so none are suggested. There are certainly areas that we would not want to cooperate with China on, advanced technologies and propulsion and remote sensing and advanced robotics and so forth, but there are many, many areas that don't approach these. There are very simple things, and I'll get into that. You know, if you look up in the sky right now, there are astronauts at risk in the Chinese space station. And not long ago, we had astronauts who were at risk in our space station. One of the things that I've mentioned in the papers that I've written of low-hanging fruit, we already have an agreement for rescue and return of astronauts, but we have done no engineering to make it even possible. So if you want to think about starting the cooperation, how about operationalizing something that we've already agreed upon, the return and rescue? Would it not be a huge humanitarian gesture and a diplomatic gesture if today we were able to say, we know you have the situation under control, but if you get into trouble, we can get supplies to your station. And if things get bad, we can get your people. And there are other areas, certainly. There's deep space exploration, there's planetary geology, there's potentially, eventually, services as backup communication, as backup supply of perishables. Maybe we should propose a joint Mars sample return mission with China. None of this will happen in the current status quo. The Wolf Amendment causes any cooperation with China, entities by NASA, to be a major policy shift, eliminating any gradual and subtle engagement. This is not to suggest that we blow open the doors of partnership with China, but rather that we signal our desire for gradual and carefully vetted cooperation on selected projects. And to be clear, this is not a discussion about the Space Force, which has to be preparing for military conflict and, unfortunately, potential war in space. And yes, the Chinese National Space Agency has direct ties to the Chinese military. Our collaboration with the Soviets and currently with the Russians deals with the same issue, and we found a way forward. Some ask, wouldn't the Wolf Amendment introduce risk to NASA and their supply chain? The answer is no. The Wolf Amendment is redundant to other broader and more effective laws that have existed for decades and address not only threats from China, but also Russia, Cuba, Iran, and many other countries. ITAR regulations, which are managed by the State Department with strong collaboration from the DoD and intelligence community, are the primary approach for guarding military information. There's also a US-China Science and Technology Cooperation Agreement, which has a list of technologies that are forbidden across all federal agencies, not only NASA, and flow down to universities and to industry. And then there's the Federal Acquisition Regulations, the FAR, which has strong language and forces, laws that protect the supply chain. There are lists of countries that you are not allowed to have in your supply chain, and those are open to NASA to use. So all of these tools are sensible and good mechanisms to make sure that our contracting is thoughtful and that we don't get unexpected surprises. That's not to say that it doesn't happen sometimes, but that's due to people not following those laws. Finally, this law is out of sync with our broader relationship with China, which includes trade with some of the leading tech companies in the world. NVIDIA, Apple, Boeing, Tesla, TikTok. NASA is a well-protected federal agency. So we should probably be more worried about how these other companies that are driving are the front of technology are protected and rely on NASA's security agency and, if necessary, support from the FBI to protect themselves. So in summary, the Wolf Amendment does not serve the interests of the United States. It has prevented nearly all civil space cooperation between the two most active and powerful countries leading in space at the most critical time in space history. It wastes time and money and micromanages NASA's executive leaders and is redundant to more effective laws and policies. It prevents our diplomatic use of space exploration as a unifying endeavor, one of the core missions of NASA, and it risks eroding our prestige as the nation leading humanity into space. NASA should be directed to engage in a dialogue with the Chinese Space Agency to investigate areas in which to begin cooperation. And upon the identification of some minor or moderate-sized projects, the Wolf Amendment should be put to rest.
Thank you very much, Dan. Dean, over to you.
Well, I'd also like to echo Dan Hart on at least one aspect, which is my thanks as well to the Space Policy Institute and Aerospace for the opportunity.
Ground already, isn't that great?
There you go. I would also observe that I would agree that this is really not a debate about the Wolf Amendment per se. The Wolf Amendment encapsulates, really, it symbolizes the broader issue, which is, should we be cooperating with China at all in space? Because I would say that, in fact, space has almost never been about space at the international level. Space has been a reflection of broader terrestrial concerns, especially when we are talking about non-like-minded nations. US, France, US, Japan, that can be about science. But whether it was the Soviet Union, now Russia, or whether it is China, we are looking at a very different type of situation. Because space, whether we can say, well, there's Space Force and NASA, but the reality is that, broadly speaking, space has been about strategic capabilities, no matter who operates or whose logo is on the side of the rocket. The space age started to avoid strategic surprise. It was driven in the earliest years for the US and Soviet Union, interestingly not for China, by the desire for reconnaissance capability to see what was on the other side of the hill. It was not about simply exploring the moon or Mars or the sun. It was the terrestrial drive. Is the Japanese fleet coming? That was John Logsdon's argument, that the US space program began on December 8th, 1941. If only we had seen the Japanese fleet coming. And if that is true, then the Soviets, their space program began on June 23rd, 1941. Are the Germans coming? And that was a major driving element before the scientific aspect. The other part here is soft power. It is demonstrating national political, economic, and technological achievement. When Sputnik flew, for all that there may have been conversations between Eisenhower and Khrushchev, the response in the United States was not, oh, look, science. It was, oh my God, the Soviets. That, I think, should be an indicator to us of the reality that in the international context, space is not so much about science as it is about these other harder aspects. Space cooperation. The ISS, US-Russian cooperation occurred after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And there are real questions now about the future of the ISS, in part because of the chilling of US-Russia relations in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine war. Why did we buy RD-180s? And interestingly, at one point became dependent on Russia for the RD-180 because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was not because Ronald Reagan said, science, cooperation, Soviet Union, let's buy RD-180s. Apollo-Soyuz did not bring about détente. Apollo-Soyuz was a product of détente, cause and effect. And it's interesting, Apollo-Soyuz arguably was ultimately born of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which occurs 6 months after this wonderful exchange of letters, which apparently did not prevent either Khrushchev or Kennedy from saying, space, that's nice. Strategic security has a higher priority. But the reality of the Cuban Missile Crisis was that it initiated for both sides a recognition of the importance of some transparency, which can be stabilizing, a view that was taken up in both Moscow and Washington, and ultimately led to things like the ABM Treaty and the First SALT Treaty, which were essential for laying the groundwork for Apollo-Soyuz. So in a sense, because of the missiles of October, you had the space docking of 1975. It's useful then to consider that the heyday of US-Chinese space cooperation, which did occur in the 1990s, was in that period when we believed the PRC would liberalize, and when in fact there were US satellites going up atop Chinese rockets. I would submit again, a lagging indicator, because it was US-Chinese relations were already pretty good in the 1990s, and the Cold War had ended, that we could look at the prospect here of US-Chinese space cooperation to the point of launching rockets. Now, what's of course interesting is we don't do that anymore. Why not? Predates the Wolf Amendment. It was the Cox Commission report and the finding that US companies, in the face of all of the laws that are going to protect us, which is why we don't need a Wolf Amendment, were nonetheless transferring technology to a PRC space program, civil space program, right? Because these are rocket, space launch vehicles, which are churned out on the same production line as China's ICBMs, including the new ICBMs that recently rolled through Tiananmen Square a few weeks ago. This goes to a more fundamental point. The PRC is not the Soviet Union, and it's very, very dangerous to analogize with something that is so different. And these differences are not simply, well, the Chinese are Asian and they don't look like Russians. Actually, there are Russians who look like Chinese and vice versa. The differences are fundamental because, one, there is a fundamentally different perception of the international system. The Soviet Union was part, in its Russian form, of the European view of the world. China, notably, isn't European. It has a very different view of things like balance of power politics. It has a very different view of the role of nations and international cooperation. There are fundamental differences in terms of international stability. We in the Soviets worked very hard not to actually shoot at each other. Proxies, yes. Stand-ins, yes. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Laos, Cambodia, Korea. It's useful to consider that the Chinese fought the Soviet Union when both countries had nuclear weapons. I bring that up to highlight that we have very different views of what is acceptable, what is stabilizing, what is, quote unquote, normal international behavior. The Soviets are not the Chinese. And finally, we have a fundamentally different view of transparency. One of the things that you hear from the Chinese quite often when we say you need to be more transparent is, but American, if I have a knife and you have a gun, how does transparency work to my benefit? We in the Soviets each felt that transparency was not a favor we did for the other side, that it was something important for both of us. And I would suggest that the Chinese attitude is not the same as the Soviets. On the fundamental issue, is it really a wide human view across all cultures, or is this a very European post-Cuban Missile Crisis view of the utility and importance of transparency? And it is this lack of transparency that has meant that there is, in fact, no foundation, such as the arms control treaties between us and the Soviets, that is essential if we are going to talk about space cooperation, much as mandated with the Chinese. And this transparency for the Chinese is very much across the board. What is the size of the PRC space budget? This is a fundamental number that I will tell you, I have looked for a little while. I've been doing this for a few months. And I don't believe that there is a single figure from the PRC of the size of their space budget. And I'm not saying, oh, yeah, well, of course they don't tell us the PLA space budget, et cetera. First off, it's very hard to find that the Chinese have a military space program if you read all their space literature. But the larger point being, there's nothing about how much they spend on space. I mean, the defense budget number, nobody takes seriously, but at least they publish one. How does the PRC make space decisions? If we're going to cooperate with the Chinese, I personally would like to know who it is that's on the other side of the table. We have the blocks, but we don't have the lines in the line and block chart. What is the relationship between Xu Xueqiang, which the Chinese language version of their websites list as the head of the Chinese manned space effort, and Hao Chun, who is the CMSEO's 主任. I don't need a translator, of course, because we all speak Chinese, I'm sure. That is one of the things. The manager, in a sense, of the CMSEO. The fact that these names aren't necessarily even on the English language version of the CMA website goes to the issue of transparency. And really, we shouldn't be surprised because at the end of the day, while one can dismiss the role of the PLA in China's overall space program, including their civilian space program, I would suggest that that is rather dangerous because there isn't really a civilian space organization and infrastructure. Every Chinese space facility has a base number. Not base number as in basic. Base number in terms of a 2-digit base, reflecting that it is part now of the military aerospace force, and also a military unit covered designator, which is used to conceal the existence of that force. In 2019, at a China Space Day, the PRC reported on the presence of these various officials. Chinese, they're very consistent. It is always in protocol order. What your experience is, so the head of CNSA, the China National Space Administration, is always first listed as a vice minister of the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. That's his actual day job. But also in precedence order when you have a list of people attending a meeting, such as China Space Day. Leading off the China Space Day, the Deputy Chief Commander of the China Manned Space Program, Qian Weiping. Those of you who are interested, Qian Weiping at the time was also the Deputy Head of the Equipment Development Department of the People's Liberation Army. That is the actual person, number 2. At the time, Xu Xueqiang was the head of the CMS, China Manned Space Effort. He was the head of the Equipment Development Department. Hao Chun, director of the China Manned Space Engineering Office, the 主任, was listed last. That is not an accident. There are many things in China that are not planned. Precedence order is planned. Fundamental security challenges. If we were to mandate cooperation, how would we communicate with the Chinese? Letters? Hard copy? That's kind of very 1990s, 1980s. Or are we going to use email? Anybody going to open their email from a Chinese address? For those of you who think absolutely you would, I would just mention Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon. Chinese penetration of US telecoms and Chinese emplacement of malware in critical infrastructure. By the way, if we're going to talk about the importance of stability and things like that, taking down a nation's, wow, they cut off my mic. I'm impressed. That is really rapid response. Sorry, Beijing. I mean, we laugh, right? Does anyone think that the Chinese aren't listening? Anybody here who plans to go to China and bring their own computer, their own cell phone? If the answer to that is yes, please don't contact me afterwards. If the answer to that is no, the simple question is, why do you value your personal information more than you value NASA's? The Chinese space effort is often characterized by themselves as crawl, walk, run. It means it's a steady progression, means it is systematic. It means putting in place the prerequisites, crawling, before you try to do things like running. I would submit that US-China space cooperation is at this time far down in terms of the broader terrestrial transaction. That what we need is to establish a firmer foundation of broader relations, the crawl part, before we get to even really trying to discuss with the PLA space cooperation, which is a walk or run endeavor. So that is why I would suggest, and we cut out again, why it is important to retain the wolf. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dean. So Dan, over to you for a few minutes if you want to reiterate thing or challenge anything that Dean has said.
Sure. So let me start off by saying the repeal of the Wolf Amendment does not start cooperation with China. The repeal of the Wolf Amendment signals our willingness to engage in a dialogue with China that may result in cooperation. And anything that we were to do in cooperating, we would have our full negotiating capability of what the project might be, as well as potentially requirements on rules of engagement and who we would be cooperating with. For instance, the United States could, if we want to, say, you know, we're not comfortable cooperating with someone so closely connected to the PLA. We'll cooperate with this university. Now, China may say no, but that would put the US in the position from a world view as the country who is willing to cooperate, which right now, China is moving into that position. China's diplomatic offensive has been to engage with developing countries, engage with our allies. I mean, there are signatories of the Artemis Accords who are cooperating with China now, and to move into the position that Kennedy placed the United States in 1962 and 1963, and where we have stayed. So repeal of the Wolf Amendment does not like let all the genies out of the bottle. It just starts the dialogue. And as far as leading and lagging indicator, again, this is a bit of semantics. It's a matter of what the leaders do and their vision. Kennedy and Eisenhower put space science and cooperation and utility as a leading indicator, as an initial diplomatic overture to the Soviets. You don't have to do that. You can wait. Reagan waited before as you point out, I agree with you. I mean, Reagan waited for things to sort of cool off and get better and then engage on space station. But it's a matter, it's a tool. It's a matter of what the President of the United States and the other leaders in our government do with it. Space can be an incredibly powerful, symbolic gesture or element in a relationship. And I agree that there is definitely an intelligence aspect with space. I mean, the Corona project, for instance, in the U.S., you know, famous initial intelligence project. Space has always been a military, viewed as having military utility. But again, very, very purposely, Eisenhower set up NASA as civilian. And he did it because he wanted to parse the scientific community and the motivations and objectives of science, which can be unifying and are, if you go to a university and you talk to PhDs, they don't usually differentiate between countries as much as
allies in the pursuit of some piece of knowledge. There's a quote here from Henry Kissinger, who I think we all know of as a key figure in the engagement with China. In 2018, he did a very interesting interview. It might have been with The Economist. He said, "I believe that it is essential that China and the United States, while looking for their security, are engaged in a dialogue in which they will seek to avoid threatening each other's interests, in which they will seek to develop some cooperative projects that bring the people closer together." And that's the end of the quote. Space exploration can certainly be one of those cooperative projects that Kissinger talked about. As far as the relationship, a little bit more on the relationship with the PLA, you know, we can negotiate things if we want to, and that's perfectly fair. We also should keep in mind that NASA does have a broad area agreement with the Space Force that's probably not lost on the Chinese. We know and they know that each country has very good cyber capability. And we should certainly assume when we deal with another country in cooperation, mostly adversaries, but also, frankly, some of our allies, that information will likely go to the military. I mean, all of the countries in the world have close relationships between their civil and military space programs. But even in that, there are areas that we can find to collaborate. And rescue of astronauts, for instance, is a very easy and clear example of that. You know, a bolt hole pattern is not an incredible military secret or a pressure of what pressure is your spacesuit. So, and what's the connector? So there's plenty that we can do together. You know, if you Google cooperation with the U.S. and China, the first thing that pops up is the Wolf Amendment. And so the message to the world, and it says it's illegal, you know, in the United States to cooperate, end of story. And so to the world, the perception.
Is that what the AI says? Yeah.
I mean, it is. I did a little bit of research before this, believe it or not. So that's the perception that we're giving the world from the United States, a very defensive posture. And is that really what we want to communicate? And I'll end with another quote. This is LBJ in his letter to the Senate for the Outer Space Treaty. "We know the losses of the failure to cooperate. If we fail now to apply the lessons we have learned, or even if we delay their application, we know the advances into space may only mean adding a new dimension to warfare. If, however, we proceed along the orderly course of full cooperation, we shall, by the very fact of cooperation, make the most substantial contribution toward perfecting peace." So that's a vision provided by one of our leaders. Again, repealing the Wolf Amendment does not jump us into full cooperation. It just signals that we are willing to have the conversation, which right now, for some reason, political and personal, that has remained in our books for over a decade, we're communicating that we are not willing to. So therefore, the Wolf Amendment should be repealed, and we should get to a normalized relationship.
Thank you. Dean?
I find it fascinating that you've now said several times repeal doesn't lead to cooperation, but your prepared remarks concluded with, we should direct NASA to find cooperation. I believe that is in your prepared remark. Now, if I'm misquoting you, I apologize. So it would seem like you would actually like to see that cooperation, which you have tempered in your rebuttal to me as, oh, we're repealing, we may not lead to. I mean, if you mandate cooperation, you're going to find cooperation. That just seems to be sort of how things work in this town. Before we start cooperating with the Chinese on astronaut rescue, I would like to see Congress mandate America cooperate with America on astronaut rescue. Because the fact that Dragon could not automatically handle astronauts wearing Starliner suits suggests that there are some rather deep-rooted problems in our own system before we start going around trying to tell other people how to do things. But that highlights that this is probably much more complex if our own space program isn't always talking to our own space program. To sort of say, well, but astronaut rescue, that's a no-brainer, that's an easy one. It's probably actually quite a bit more difficult, particularly in a system that chooses not to discuss much, including bolt configuration, suit pressure, et cetera. It's interesting when we look, for example, at China's sample retrieval mission from the moon, how long it took them to share any of that data, scientific data, non-military, with the rest of the world. It's a lovely idea to be able to say, well, we just won't cooperate with the PLA. Well, cooperate with Chinese universities. First off, that does not mean that you're not cooperating with the PLA. Consider that the Chinese university system is not entirely run by the Ministry of Education. Beijing University of Aeronautics and Astronautics, Nanjing University of Aeronautics and Astronautics, Harbin Institute of Technology. These are some of the most important aerospace-related universities in the PRC. They are outside the Ministry of Education. They are within the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. Why? Because they are defense industry universities. So, if you cooperate with any of those places, you are getting in bed with the PLA. You won't find that at the Ministry of Education website, but this is the fundamental reality. The importance of dialogue. I don't disagree that we should have dialogue. It would be nice, for example, if during the S&ED talks, the strategic and economic dialogues of the Obama administration, when the Chinese came, we suggested to them that we talk about space. This is pre-Wolf Amendment. And the Chinese said no. And we said, we would like to have broad conversations on space policy. The Chinese said no. And finally, they said, we would like to brief you on our space program and efforts. And the Chinese said, absolutely. Thank you very much. And we'd like to hear from you on broadly what your views are. No. So why? Because transparency is a favor. Transparency is something I grant you. And as anyone who trades with China will tell you, these are not an altruistic group. What is the price? We talk about the need for cooperation, the desirability of cooperation. And one of the questions that is not really addressed is, what do we think the Chinese want for cooperation? What do we think they want for that dialogue? A friend of mine, my old boss at the Heritage Foundation, used to say, the Chinese believe in win-win negotiations. Chinese win twice. He's a little more cynical. I'm more depressing. But the reality is, all those countries that are trading with China, that are presumably seeing this open China, this China that wants to cooperate. Go to Colombo in Sri Lanka. Go to Ecuador. Ask them how much cooperation is actually occurring with China. Consider that in Argentina, where the Chinese built a massive radio space telescope, Argentinian scientists are not the people who get this book first. It is the Chinese. So should there be dialogue between us and the PRC? Absolutely. Should it include the all-important strategic domain of space, where, let me just also note here, we have rules, we have laws. Microsoft hired Chinese engineers for DoD contracts. NASA, of course, would never do that. Really? Not to impugn anyone from NASA, but if a company cannot get it through its head that you probably shouldn't have Chinese engineers doing the software programming on a DoD contract, I think actually more barriers just to remind everyone of the importance of security is and of right ought to be a priority, not something that is downgraded. Thank you.
You. I've got a couple follow-up questions to each of the authors, poking at some of the arguments, and then it's after we'll turn it over to you all for some of your questions. Dean, I'll turn to you first. You know, I mentioned my intro, we both mentioned, all of us mentioned, that China now has quite sophisticated capabilities across a wide range of things, including, its own very functional rockets, human spaceflight capabilities. One of the rationales you hear about why we need the Wolf Amendment and protect technology is to prevent the tech transfer that is going to accelerate China's program. Is that still as important if they have close to the same level of technology in some of these areas?
First off, there is why the Wolf Amendment was created in the first place. A lot of it had to do with religion, had to do with human rights. I think since then, the same way that what is the Wolf Amendment? Thank you for reading the text. Also, there is the same issue of, well, it's to prevent technology transfer. It was to prevent the Chinese space program from developing. If that really was the purpose, that failed, but, and this is important, it failed because the Chinese were absolutely going to develop a space program of its own because they said they were going to in 1958. So that point there raises more. Now, what about technology transfer? There are certain things the Chinese still have trouble with, and they are often surprising. Look at the Long March 5B. This is the current Chinese heavy lift vehicle. The Long March 5B fires its engines into orbit, meaning the first stage doesn't separate. Why? You know why? I have no idea. But I would submit that it is quite likely because they are having trouble with such a large circumference rocket getting the stage separations. Now, this is something that we have figured out how to do. And would probably be something that the Chinese would very much like to learn how to do. And this is like Krytrons for Iraq for their nuclear weapons program. This is not new technology, but this is important technology that the Chinese would very much like to obtain. Does the Wolf Amendment per se block it off? Maybe, maybe not. But it is the sort of thing that probably would be a topic of very easy conversation because it's old technology.
And for those who didn't catch the 5B that was mentioned, one of the challenges is because of the way that it's used and the way it's designed, they cannot do a proactive deorbit on a safe trajectory of the upper stage, hence leading to the multiple instances we've seen where these very large upper stages have come back in an uncontrolled manner and caused public concern and media concern, and in some cases potentially damage. Yeah.
But not Chinese concern. Because as the Chinese have said, the world is 60% ocean. That is actually what the Chinese have said when people.
I mean, it happens to be true, but yes,
Yes,
yeah.
nobody has died as a result of that. So therefore, I guess we don't have to, but I mean, this is the point is, that is not the comment of a responsible space actor.
All right, I can't help myself, so I got to jump in. Because I've engineered around a few launch vehicles. Separation is, the Chinese know how to do separation.
They do.
The atmosphere, if you're at 500,000 feet versus, a low LEO is not a heck of a lot different. So that's probably not what's troubling them. Your other point is right on target, which is they do it because it enhances the vehicle and they don't care. It's not in their value system, which is one of the reasons why having dialogue with them is important, because we need to somehow bring them into some kind of norms of behavior. We need to negotiate that with the Chinese, because we're getting to where we're going to both have thousands and tens of thousands of satellites. We've got launch vehicles with range safety concerns. The amount of problems and difficulties are mounting, and without communication in space, and NASA being a very, very important aspect of that, we're just going to get into trouble.
The arrogance reflected in the we need to bring the Chinese into line. That attitude is exactly one of the things that arguably we should need to retain the Wolf Amendment in order not to further damage U.S.-China relations. We have this attitude that we are somehow going to bring you forward. We will educate you. We will teach you how it's supposed to be done. And one of the things that is very clear from the Chinese perspective, it is in Xi Jinping's China dream, which includes the China space dream, is thank you very much. We are a returned great power. We are not here to be educated by you. You need to start learning lessons from us. And that is part of the underlying challenge of dialogue of any sort, is this is a nation with 5,000 years of civilization that is not likely to sort of say, oh, yeah, we're going to adopt your approach. Maybe if it's more efficient.
They may not adopt our approach, but there are fundamental things like blowing up small villages that around the world that damage your reputation. So there's motivations beyond an arrogant directive from the U.S. to do something. There are some universal values that we can, if we engage with the world, with China, we'll see progress. If we don't engage, we probably won't.
What happened on June 4th, 1989?
Well, I was 28. I don't remember.
The Chinese do. The Chinese, and they have worked very actively to make sure everyone forgets. June 4th, 1989 was Tiananmen Square, for which, by the way, we retained sanctions, which limits our ability to cooperate and have dialogue and all of that sort of thing. And to this day, what happened in Tiananmen, assuming anything happened in Tiananmen, was a result of the American CIA creating an effort to topple the Chinese government and the rightful rule of the CCP. That is how they present this to the world. And we may say, well, there are certain common views, universal human rights. And the Chinese would say, when you say universal, whose universe?
So I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to open up the floor to questions. George, is there oh, you put the mic here. Sorry. If you'd like to ask a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll come around. Scott, okay. I guess the host has a privilege.
No, I was just going to suggest we've been talking about bilateral, focus on it, and I would just throw out there that there are multilateral ways of engagement. So we work with the Chinese a lot in the ITU, where we have some difficulties here and there, but actually not that big a deal. Space Resources Working Group, actually fairly aligned. We don't want the UN to tell us what to do. They don't want to tell UN to tell them what to do.
Common ground.
We have some common ground. Working on a lunar activities consultative mechanism, within, so we can exchange information about who does what, where. We've had some progress in a breakthrough of the Chinese sending us an email, regarding maneuver, which we've been on their case for a long time about. Maybe I guess a question would be, as you look at the Wolf Amendment, how does your view of multilateral opportunities for cooperation, somewhat forced because of the Wolf Amendment, really affect things? I mean, on one hand, you could argue, well, gee, we don't need to repeal the Wolf Amendment because we're doing perfectly fine. Or you could argue, well, progress in the multilateral area means we should repeal the Wolf Amendment, so we do, I don't know, more. I obviously, where I lean. I think multilateral stuff is useful, and we don't need to repeal the Wolf Amendment, but maybe take a different view.
So we'll take 2 more questions, and we'll address them as a group.
We got to remember them.
Oh, I'll help you with that. No worries. Over here.
Hi, Charity Whedon, Atlantic Council Geotech Center, non-resident senior fellow. It seems to me that we're talking about different things here. At the beginning, we were talking about this is an executive versus legislative power struggle in a way. And that doesn't necessarily lend to this being about strategic power. So my question is, can the executive still hold back US-China cooperation in space without this amendment? Can the president dictate to the nominee for NASA, this is how I want it to be, don't have cooperation, but I fail to see why NASA should be omitted from this administration's tool belt to shape foreign policy should they decide to use it? So I guess my question here is who benefits more from the Wolf Amendment? Is it the US? Do we think China's desperately and eager to collaborate with NASA? Or does it benefit China more, where they can conveniently use the Wolf Amendment as an excuse to go unilaterally and build norms? Thank you.
Great, thank you. And one more over here.
Thank you. I'm Jordan Grossman. I'm an undergraduate student here at the Elliott School. I wanted to ask, since the United States and China have both taken a role in developing this space on infrastructure of developing nations, is there any room for cooperation in that area, or are there too many obstacles to cooperation there? Thank you.
Talk about instead of U.S.-China doing more with developing countries, or U.S.-China working with the developing countries?
U.S. and China working together in developing countries.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so there's a question about because the Wolf Amendment does not prohibit interaction with China in a multilateral setting, which is what Scott was referring to. So question, one point was, is the multilateral good enough? I think there's a very good point here about this sort of started with this debate between the executive branch and Congress over kind of who has authority here. And I'll say the executive branch argument is under Article 2, the president has very broad powers for foreign policy. And that was sort of the administration's response to the Wolf Amendment. And I'll say at the moment, there is a renewed debate over the role of the executive branch versus the legislative branch and how things are conducted. So that's up for grabs. A question of who benefits more from this ban, is it US or China? And then this question about what is the engagement with the developing world, which both countries have signaled in greater interest recently to do with those countries many more countries that want to get involved in space. So Dan, any of those you want to?
Yeah, so let me start with Scott's point. Yeah, there are multilateral forums that are doing some things. Interestingly enough, the announcement that we actually got an email from China saying we're about to collide with you, stay put, we're going to do a maneuver, was sort of almost a big surprise at the IAC that was brought up, and it made all the news. I mean, holy cow, we actually got an email. Also interestingly, they didn't send it to Commerce, which does space traffic. They sent it to NASA. And of course, Commerce is not under the Wolf Amendment. But importantly, they also have, I don't know, 40 or 50 people and a much smaller capability. And so NASA was a logical place to send a message like that. But what if it was a more complicated issue? What if it was something that required some analysis, that there was erratic behavior, that there was something to work together on? The Wolf Amendment, I mean, could we get our act together quickly enough in the current, realm without breaking the law? Because there would be collaboration and planning and all that kind of good stuff that the Wolf Amendment outlaws. So, I mean, that's exactly the one of the reasons why we need to get rid of the Wolf Amendment, so that you can actually, if something happens in space, you can actually work together. More broadly, though, those forums are sort of low level. They're not really making big movements in diplomatic space diplomacy between the US and China. We're kind of agreeing that nobody should bother us. We're not really collaborating
closely on, how we're going to stay out of each other's hair with mega constellations, or pushing space forward, or using the symbol of space collaboration as a way to warm the room. So we're not using the tool as effectively as we could, and the Wolf Amendment is stopping us. Over to the next question. I mean, yeah, I mean, that is reducing the executive branch's lateral mobility in dealing with Chinese relations. It has been an issue here. I mean, its purpose of the Wolf Amendment has been to sort of bridle our foreign policy in space. You could easily picture in the Trump-Xi meeting, if they got into a bind and the president said, and if it was on his mind, of saying, yeah, let's do something together in space. And it could have actually, even in this initial engagement, actually could have been something positive that came out to come out of the meeting. We're going to have discussions about space exploration. So I mean, there's opportunity lost, and it's a bind that we've put ourselves in, and it's a loss to the U.S. It's a loss to perception, potentially, that the world has of the U.S. in that. To the last question, I would say that would be very hard. Okay, this is the question of China and the U.S. working together with developing countries. That is like the tip of the spear in the competition. I mean, who's going to influence in South America? Who's going to influence in countries in Africa and Southeast Asia? That would probably be the last thing that would happen. So yeah, I don't see that happening anytime soon. Maybe in my lifetime.
Dean? Let me take the questions in reverse. So the issue of cooperation with the Chinese in third countries. It's important to recognize two things. One, China, through the Chinese Communist Party, is a whole of society system, coupled with the reality that their economy is different from ours. So you have a very heavy state-owned enterprise aspect. That combination means the Chinese government, through the CCP, through the government, can want direct investment that may never actually generate a profit, because there are other state interests at stake. China's space investments abroad, radio telescopes in Argentina, et cetera, are classic examples of the Chinese pushing state interests, not necessarily monetary. Our system is built on private enterprise. At the end of the day, NASA is not likely to do investment in any country on space. At the end of the day, it will be Boeing, United Launch Alliance, Raytheon. And they do look at bottom lines. So you have a fundamental misalignment here of what the two sides are doing and why. Legislative versus executive. This conversation makes it seem like, wow, Congress suddenly decided to interfere with how the executive manages things and chose NASA as the element. I'd also note, to begin with, as far as I know, then Administrator Bolden never briefed Congress on what happened during the meeting that he wasn't supposed to have, and which was a gauntlet thrown down by OSTP Director Holdren. So who knows, maybe if Charlie Bolden were to brief everyone, things could change, at least by ameliorating a little of the executive legislative aspect. But I would point to FY 2000's National Defense Authorization Act, which specifically set off over a dozen areas that are prohibited by the Department of Defense, prohibited to the Department of Defense, in terms of conversations with the PRC. The legislative branch, the Wolf Amendment is not unique. The legislative branch imposes a variety of requirements on a variety of agencies over what they can and cannot do with the Chinese and with other countries. This is partly the battle between the branches. Who benefits from this? It's an effort actually by us to do something called whole of government, which we do very badly. And
say all the time, right?
I wouldn't say all the time. But an interesting question here about the cooperation aspect is, where do the Chinese cooperate? Back to that win-win equals, the Chinese win twice. The Chinese coordinate with other people. They sign lots of deals and agreements. But as we see with the Asia Pacific Space Cooperation Organization, which was funded by the Chinese, headed by the Chinese, and headquartered in China, what we see is the Chinese and a gaggle of smaller countries that get money, that get access to some Chinese facilities and things. But if we look at the Canada arm on the space station and the space shuttle, or the Japanese helping to build modules on the ISS, that's serious cooperation. And I would suggest that we don't see this between the Chinese and almost anybody else. Forget the Americans. Cooperation with the Chinese is not like cooperation with the US, which is not to make us out to be the good guys or anything like that, just to say it is a very different model of how much transparency am I going to allow to any other player. Because another Chinese quote, and by the way, these are real quotes, these are not from fortune cookies and things. It is not for the weak to reveal to the strong. And the Chinese consistently portray themselves as being weak, even as their technology develops. Finally, just on the multilateral aspect, what I would say is that the multilateral aspects of things like ITU, I believe, Scott, you've had some interesting experiences with the Chinese at the ITU and whether or not they are stepping on other people's frequencies on things like GNT, et cetera, position navigation and timing. So multilateral organizations are a forum where we can have discussion. We can have space discussions. NOAA does, commerce. The question is, at the end of the day, beyond these very specific technical practicalities, what is the symbolism? And tying the Chinese, trying to get them to actually act in a multilateral forum responsibly, I think does put them on display. And even then, whether it's human rights or ITU frequency spectrum allocation or Chinese behavior at the International Civil Aviation Organization meetings, what we see is not an appeal to the broader interests of the public, but a very consistent push of China's position, aided and abetted by, you can find this on Google, Chinese UN officials violating the oath of the UN bureaucracy, which says that you forswear national loyalty and policy to the UN's goals. Chinese officials on video saying, at the UN, I pursue China's interests in my role here at the UN.
I think, actually, I want to say, I think it's an interesting point about the executive branch. For me, one of the interesting data points is that no administration over the last something has, at least that I can recollect, has been willing to go to Congress with a plan and kind of do the work that is outlined in the Wolf Amendment. That's Republican or Democratic, right? That to me signals that it really is a real obstacle, even if it was meant to be only a, come ask permission first. But let's take two more questions here. Two more questions, then we'll, here.
Thank you. My name is Karen Feldstein. Until recently, I was Associate Administrator at NASA for International and Interagency Relations. So I'm geeking out on this debate, which is really fun. I could have blogged questions every 30 seconds throughout, but I'd love to take you just a little bit more in the gray and look at the way forward. So let's assume there's no one who would find it today politically tenable to champion the elimination of the Wolf Amendment at this moment. What do you think the appetite is or should be to exploit the means that are still available for dialogue with China or coordination with China, not only in the large multilateral means, but there are lots of actors in the world that would like nothing better than to broker even a small multilateral discussion on some of these topics. And of course, the State Department and others could have norms discussions and policy discussions. The difficult part is getting NASA to the table. So if there's appetite for having increased engagement, even if it's not the kumbaya of new projects or more sample return or something like that, how should that be pursued? How should it be signaled to NASA? Who's poised to make that decision? How would it go forward? And should it?
We'll take one more.
Thank you. Good morning, gentlemen. Anthony Chinrosmi. I'm an Air Force active duty judge advocate and current student at Johns Hopkins SAIS. My question is about kind of China and their three warfares kind of approach and philosophy, because you both alluded to kind of public opinion, and so I'm kind of wondering with respect to a couple of things China has pushed, for example, the PPWT, the Prevention of Placement of Weapons Treaty, as well as PAROS, Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space. So they're kind of trying to portray themselves that it is for peaceful purposes, kind of space exploration, science, interests of all mankind. And so I'm wondering, is there potentially a lost opportunity here if we maintain the Wolf Amendment, that China is portraying itself as kind of that actor that is cooperative in the international community? And how that can kind of tie into kind of whether the Wolf Amendment itself should be retained, or if there is anything else that kind of U.S. can do with respect to its strategy. Thank you.
So we've got, does the Wolf Amendment kind of put the U.S. in the frame of being the bad guy, and China the ability to go out and kind of put its message out there? And what can we do proactively, or what should we do proactively, even if we retain the Wolf Amendment? Dan, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start over here. So I think what you see happening in the world, the stage of world opinion is China is making inroads, and their voice track, their message is, we are open to collaboration. We are in favor of the peaceful use of space. We are saluting the UN treaties, even if they're not doing it. Even if in reality that's not their plan, their persona is one of openness, and they're trying to move in as the country leading humanity in space and replace the United States. I mean, that's what's going on. And so yes, the Wolf Amendment puts us in we look petty. It's illegal for us to engage with China because we have a law against it for some reason. So it puts us on the defensive, a weak position on the world stage. And that is one of the reasons why it should be repealed. I just want to mention, there was a great op-ed in Space News not long ago by a gentleman named Michael Listner, I think, that talked about the Outer Space Treaty and talked about what the US should be doing. And I thought he made a great point, and I think we should be engaging with China in the way that he described, which is, number one, we should bring focus on the fact that we landed on the moon, almost 60 years ago, and that we passed a law in the United States that said when we planted the flag on the moon, it was a ceremonial event to recognize the accomplishment and did not represent a territorial claim or anything like that, that we respect the UN treaty. And we should go back to being an advocate for the Outer Space Treaty and pull China into that discussion. And we can argue who's the broader, better person, and if they're evil, as you kind of maybe pointed out, maybe will be manipulated. But they seem to be moving in a position where they're focusing on the UN treaty. Let's also embrace the UN treaty and then try to evolve that into some kind of norms of behavior. And the problem with the Artemis Accords, of course, and kind of moving over maybe to the other question on what should we do. The problem with the Artemis Accords, of course, is we didn't start with negotiating the language with our adversaries. And so they don't have a piece of the action. It's perceived as U.S. and allies document. So, of course, maybe it should be it instead of was in the document. They still won't, agree on it. Basic politics. I think forward-wise, I thought it was interesting that that the office's space office was put into the Commerce Department. But that is an opening in the current structure of things. And so perhaps the way forward would be for them to at least engage in, I'm breaking up. They've got me now. Perhaps for us to engage in at least space sustainability issues, you know, the Long March 5 issue, the protocols for collisions and dialogue. And so perhaps there's a channel there. The other thing that we could do is to leverage our allies. I mean, ESA could be negotiating and starting a document with China. The problem, I mean, and I think that may be necessary given the current status quo, that perhaps ESA should take the lead. Of course, in doing that, we're giving up the lead. So it goes back to the other question. You know, we're sort of retreating from being the leader in the world stage. But so there are other avenues. You know, we can have discussions at some of these other forums, but they're not really hard-hitting major policy moves we're going to make. So I think those are the two things that at least come to mind initially.
Dean, on the two questions of allow China to portray themselves as sort of the good guy, and what can we do even if we retain the Wolf Amendment?
In terms of what can we do if we, assuming that we retain the Wolf Amendment, I do think it's fascinating that your interpretation of mine of a bipartisan unwillingness to challenge, including when Democrats controlled the Congress as well, to repeal. You're saying it is too big an obstacle, no one's willing to do it. And my assessment would be that there is, in fact, bipartisan support. It's not that it's hard, it's nobody wants to be seen as repealing it. Potato, potato. But with regards to, therefore, if we assume that the Wolf Amendment is retained, what are some of the other options? NOAA already talks to China. These legislators were not stupid. They said no NASA. They could have said no space, period, right? I think it's the 18th wing regularly informs people of, where is it?
18th Space Defense.
Space Defense regularly informs people of there's a conjunction coming. We have informed the Chinese. So, they often don't even acknowledge that. I don't think that has anything to do with the Wolf Amendment and just rudeness on their part.
Or maybe they're getting emails from the U.S. military, and they also have an aversion to opening emails and attachments.
That
right?
could be, but then they do they react, however, to those warnings. The point here being, there are multilateral, there are non-NASA. If it really came down to things, presumably there are waivers that could be obtained if it was truly pressing or truly that important. It appears that so far nothing has really risen to that level. Now, I would personally be kind of curious, did the Chinese offer, when the Starliner astronauts couldn't come back, did the Chinese say, you know what? Give us the details and we'll send a Shenzhou up and bring you back. Maybe we would have said no, maybe we would have said yes, maybe, but the point is, we didn't get that, as far as I know. With regards to the Chinese looking good, and the three warfares in particular, man, that's an entire separate lecture, which I've actually given at the JAG school down in Charlottesville. Suffice to say, I have not used the word evil. I would never use, not never, I would almost never use the word evil. Because the Chinese are pursuing their interests. And their interests include, as with every other country, to portray themselves as the good guys. There aren't too many countries out there that walk around saying, I am the bad guy, I twirl my mustache, I enjoy oppressing people. Not even Kim Jong-un does that, and he comes close. So the point here is, of course the Chinese are going to say, PPWT and Paros, if only the West would go along with that, we'd be good. The fact that no Chinese or Russian ASAT system would be affected by that, we're just not going to talk about that. What I would suggest is we need to up our game in terms of public relations. I actually agree with Dan. The Outer Space Treaty is a classic example. The Russians are the ones accused of potentially deploying a nuclear weapon in space, which is a blatant violation.
The one thing it
The
prohibits.
one thing it specifically prohibits, weapons of mass destruction deployed, based in space. Interestingly, the Chinese response is, we don't think it's happening. Now, we supposedly have informed them to the best of our ability, not through NASA. I don't expect them to believe us. But again, it goes to, I think, it is on us to broadcast our message. But PPWT, Paros, COPUOS, all of that is not affected by the Wolf Amendment. And therefore, I'm not really sure that whether it exists or not affects our ability to project a better strategic communications message in that regard.
So we'll close on last question from me. You know, is this debate really all just manufactured? It partly is. And whether or not we should keep or repeal, and is the answer we modify it to perhaps carve out some areas where NASA is allowed to do some engagement without having to go through all of these permission hurdles, but for other things they still have to. That's something I've heard floated in the community. Do we think that is that the compromise that we really should be talking about instead of do we keep it or do it as go? Dan, do you want to? And you know, short 30
So this
seconds.
is, should we modify it or should we, okay. So I mean, look, the government can operate without it. I mean, if the government is actually not completely dysfunctional, which is like a dream, okay, I got it. The executive branch, the Congress have power beyond the Wolf Amendment. And so they can negotiate. The threat of another Wolf Amendment is there. I mean, so it ought to be repealed. It doesn't really serve a purpose today except to stop NASA from doing anything. And it, you know, if they did want to do something, you know, it's an enormous bureaucracy to try to make something happen. So it ought to be repealed. Could you modify it? Yes, if that's the only way forward is to give another, you know, say, except for, you know, moon samples. I mean, you know, you could carve it up and start and progress. Maybe people would be more comfortable that way. But the real answer is to repeal it.
Dean?
One, I would retain it. And two, I would say the following. Bureaucrats like loopholes the way mice supposedly like cheese. And the problem with an exception is eventually the exception swallows the rule. The simplest, least bureaucratic is yes or no. It's very black and white. It's yes or no. It's the 40, you know, from back to school with Rodney Dangerfield. I only have one question in 47 parts. The exception begets counter or non-exception. Easier, far easier. Keep it, whereas Dan would suggest, end it. But in terms of, if you want to see real bureaucratic waste, you know, 47 parts.
That leads to a whole discussion on export controls. I think, right? All right, so I think we'll end there for today. Again, my pleasure to both you gentlemen for coming out and engaging in this. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is based on a paper that we wrote, which they've contributed to. I have some copies here in the front if you're interested in reading the more verbose discussion of some of these issues. That's also available online. But please join me in thanking our panelists.